Hello everybody, my name is Kalela Thompson and I am a first-year MFA student at San Diego State University. I am currently enrolled in the Living Writers course, and we read an array of books this semester, 5 novels in total, but today I wanted to do a book review on Suzi Ehtesham-Zadeh's book, Zan. It is a collection of short stories of experiences of Iranian women, and it really impacted me, and I wanted to give a brief overview for those that may consider reading the novel. In Ehtesham-Zadeh's novel, there are 16 short stories, and they explore many themes, but the ones that I wanted to particularly focus on today are queer identity, political unrest and protest, sexuality, and balancing identity as an Iranian in and outside the United States. As someone who is not Iranian and is not familiar with the culture, I learned a lot in reading this book. A really prominent theme for me in this novel was the concept of queer identity. I learned a lot about how that is revered in Iran for many people, especially traditionally, and how queerness is something that is often not talked about or is shunned or looked down upon. It was really, really interesting to read different accounts within this book and notice the different circumstances, but the common suppression of these relationships. Tying into queer identity is the full concept of sexuality in and of itself. There are several stories in this novel that deal with that in both heteronormative and homosexual relationships. It was very interesting to read and see the tension that comes with engaging in these relationships prior to an age that is deemed socially acceptable or in a relationship that is accepted by your family. It is something that growing up in a Western environment I have never had to experience, and it was very interesting to hear about this account. Branching off from the concept of sexuality and queerness, we have to talk about political revolution and unrest and those themes in the novel. Ehtesham-Zadeh moved back to Tehran during the Shah regime and writes a lot about that and puts that in her book from a fictionalized perspective, the perspective of older and younger women. Living in a Western world, we see protests, but it's a very different context and a very different circumstance. But there are several, stories in this novel that transport you to a place that living in California, as someone who is not familiar with this background, I had never heard of before. This book gives a different perspective, both from across seas and in Tehran, and on the ground, what's happening, how people in Tehran actually feel about these circumstances and how they are taking action. And I feel that in reading this, I found a lot of parallels between this specific circumstance, but also circumstances around the globe in many different countries. Another theme that Ehtesham-Zadeh explores in this novel is the retention of Iranian culture and pride, living overseas and living in Tehran. There are several stories in this book that acknowledge that concept and that work through that with us as a reader. One of them being the story of 2 girls who grew up in Iran but have lived in New York City much of their life, and they return and are mystified by their home country and seeing their parents, and are aghast with everything that they're taking in, almost like tourists, but also having to face the harsh realities of life back home and why they left in the first place. We have stories of parents who have immigrated and left Iran and have moved to the United States and see their children assimilating to Western culture and how that impacts them and how it wears down on them in a way that, if you haven't been in that circumstance, is indescribable. The stories that surveys the retention of Iranian culture and how that shifts through generations after moving and immigrating from that country is Dying in America, and it explores a father, a patriarch of a family who has recently passed on, and how his children have assimilated to Western culture and how that started to slowly break him over time. I wanted to quickly read an excerpt of that. It is on page 148, and it begins, "But in her heart, she knew that his death began earlier than that. He had begun to die years and years ago, maybe as far back as the time when the children had defied his wishes and decided to pursue impractical degrees in philosophy and literature, when they boasted of their alternative sexual practices, when they brought home blonde partners whose English even his non-native ears detected as improper. It was even possible, she thought, that he had begun to die earlier still, during the children's adolescent years, when they insisted on dragging him to Yosemite and Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon, declaring these places to be the most beautiful on earth, when they had never seen the Alborz and Zagros Mountains, the windswept plains of Khuzestan, or the Great Salt Lake of Urmia. She remembered, with a stab of guilt, how they had blared rap music in the car while driving with their father through landscapes that were foreign to him, but that most surely had reminded him of home. There is beautiful prose intertwined in this story, but also a different perspective that I believe many people can relate to. I am someone who has an immigrant parent, and I know that many people have immigrant parents from all over the globe, and I can't imagine the perspective of moving to the United States for a different future, however that may be, and seeing your lineage, your culture kind of shifting and metamorphosizing through your children, and how that may affect you and how you may feel about it. Continuing with the theme of Iranian culture and how it's portrayed in Americanized second-generation Iranian offspring or children, I wanted to read this passage. They were tourists in their own country. The parents noticed this in every conversation the daughters held in stilted Farsi, in their new gestures that seemed copied from an American television program, in every request they made to be driven to the bazaar or to the cello kababi, as if these normal features of everyday life in their country had become exotic to them. They marveled over fresh fruit from their grandparents' orchards, declaring it would be like no fruit they had ever tasted, even though they had eaten fruit from these same trees throughout their childhoods. They went on shopping expeditions and returned with mundane objects, souvenirs made from foreigners, clay vases and ordinary teapots and cheap factory-made tablecloths, packaging them with care and storing them lovingly in their suitcases, as though they were precious treasures. Later on, during an encounter with the morality police, the passage reads, the younger sister tightened her headscarf, and the older one lifted the back of her hand to her mouth and wiped her lips. They promised to be more respectful in the future, and the Kahar let them go. They told their mother about the incident as soon as they got home, erupting into giggles as they spoke. The mother had lived with the morality police for many years, and had nothing but scorn for the group's backward notions of feminine propriety. Still, it disturbed her to see her daughters ridiculing something that had become a fact of life in their country, something she herself had to contend with daily. She imagined her daughters telling her friends in California about the incident, all of them reacting to it with smugness and derision and glee. Anecdote as well of reacting as if it's another when that is your lineage is very interesting. Continuing with the theme of Iranian identity and the questions and circumstances that poses in the Western world, we look to stories like Many Sides. There are several stories in this novel that overview dating as an Iranian woman and dating other men that are not Iranian men, particularly in these stories, white men. The circumstances that unravel, without giving too much away, we see women subjected to fetishization, political ignorance, and a lack of empathy or awareness from their partners. And I think women of Iranian descent and women of color in general can greatly relate to these circumstances. There are so many valuable stories in Ehtesham-Zadeh's book Zan, but I do not want to give them all away. However, I will say that this book, out of the many we read this semester, was very impactful, and I related to it personally in some ways that I did not expect. So if you're thinking of reading this book, I would highly recommend it. And if you are thinking of taking this course, I would also highly recommend it. The great thing about Living Writers is we get the chance to meet these writers or authors face to face and hear background about the story that you cannot get from just reading it page by page. That is going to be it for me today, and I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope you all have a chance to read the book. Thank you so much.